Okay, it is time for our class to start. And I think we're in chapter 6. Okay, chapter 6, verse 1. Now, what we're going to have here is a section by Luke of some controversies, where he has controversy with the leaders of the Jews. You know, of course, how I used, instead of scribe, I used those authorized to interpret the law, because I think that's more descriptive of what they were and did than just the term scribe.
While you're talking about that, I've noticed that in several different places you will use the word human instead of mankind. And on Tuesday morning, Joy had taught a lesson, and I noticed that she's using the word human in her notes. She's not translating. Is that something that's getting to be more popular, just using the word human rather than mankind or people?
Yes, it is the attempt to be as gender-free in places where the text obviously means both men and women.
People doesn't do that anymore.
Yes.
To use people.
Yes. The new NIV, they do it a little differently, but it is an attempt to bring the meaning of the text into modern usage. It is not just doing it for political correctness or something. It is where the text seems to be obviously dealing with all people, then I did, and so modern translations do too, try to do the equivalent of language, yes. And I know Joy does the same thing. We've talked about it. And, okay. So we have here, and one the things that Jesus had controversy with the Jewish leaders about was table fellowship. Now, that sounds kind of odd to us, but remember, even after the church had been in existence for several years, maybe 20 to 25 years, the church still had the problem of table fellowship. That's what the book of Galatians is all about, is with whom can you sit down to a meal? And even though Peter was the first one to preach the gospel to Gentiles, he wavered on that. And Paul had to rebuke him publicly for doing that. And so it's something that Jesus anticipated, and Paul was on good, solid gospel foundation when he did. So this is one. Another one was on keeping the Sabbath. Jesus kept the Sabbath, but his idea about what one could do on the Sabbath was vastly different from what the Pharisees thought you could do. They did, and this is their own term, they put a hedge around the law. That is, here you've got the law that says, remember the Sabbath to keep it set apart, holy. Well, they built a fence around it further out so that you couldn't inadvertently transgress it. But like all people who do that, it didn't take long until the fence became the place where you stopped. And if you didn't see that you should stop there, they thought you were not a good Jew. and they read you out of their fellowship, especially their table fellowship or their Sabbath keeping. So that's, and this is where Jesus is the forerunner of the idea of the Gentiles being included in the covenant of God. If you really want to study that, you ought to read a book by N.T. Wright. It's about 550 pages long, and it's his essays on what he calls Pauline perspectives. I wanted to get his another book, but by the time by the time I could get there, it was all sold out.
That happens quite often
Yeah.
at the lectures.
So because I couldn't walk very fast. In fact, I wouldn't have even gotten there then if Edward Fudge hadn't stopped his golf cart and
Offered you a ride.
well, and I couldn't even get up on the golf cart. Somebody came along and grabbed me by the seat of the pants and put me up on the golf cart, or I wouldn't have made it then. But I guess I got the book that was most expensive.
Which one did you miss out on?
What?
Which one did you not get?
It was a new one that he had just come out with, and he didn't have very many copies, and it went like that.
And this one is actually more complete.
Yeah.
It was essays from 1978 through 2012.
Amazon has 57 new and used copies from $25.89.
What is it?
Pauline Perspectives, Essays on Paul.
Oh yeah, I've got that one. Yep. I paid $45 for it.
Should be maybe 20.
But it really is informative about many of these ideas. And I would recommend, if you really want to study the subject, that you get some of N.T. Wright's materials. Try to get his more popular materials, because you'll get bogged down in the scholarly ones. It's just more than you want to know. Sometimes it's more than I want to know. Okay, but this is what's going on. On the Sabbath, while he was going through some grain fields, his disciples were plucking the heads of grain and rubbing the kernels of grain out of the heads and eating them. Now, I want to ask you, which one of those actions on the part of the disciples were the thing that the Pharisees objected to? Now, you be quiet. I'm going to tell you like I tell Jesse. You've been there before, so you just be quiet. Which one do you think?
I don't know. I mean, I'm guessing the rubbing the kernels because it's harvesting.
No, it is the threshing.
Oh, that's the threshing. Oh, okay.
Threshing was not permitted on the Sabbath, according to the... Now, here is their rule. Their general rule was, if it was something that people did for a living, then it was forbidden to be done on the Sabbath. That's the reason they were against healing on the Sabbath, because doctors healed, and that was a professional money making. Now, the reasoning is fairly logical, but Jesus didn't buy it because it was man-made. It was not just sticking with the text of the Bible. They would let you do something like feed your own animals, or get an animal out of the pit, because those were emergency things. And you see, when you get in that mode of thinking, it eventually comes down to you do it because I say you should do it. And that is the sin. If we today bind where Jesus has not bound, if we set up standards of conduct that Jesus did not set up, that is a sin. I don't care what your intention is. And we just do it all the time. We set up standards and they sound good to us. We use reasoning and we use prejudice. We use a lot of human, there's your human. We use a lot of human reasoning in it, but our reasoning is not God's binding.
I think of Jesus always saying, you've heard men say this, but this is what I say.
Yes, and he was the Lord of the Sabbath. We're going to get to that. Some of the Pharisees said, why are your disciples should be doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath? And I just want you to know, it was the rubbing the grain out. They were threshing the grain. I guess if they ate them directly out of the pod, I can't imagine doing that, they might not have objected. They probably could have found something to object to because they were objecting to him. They felt the sting of his teaching. They could not refute it. He always beat them at their own game. And that's something that since we don't live in an honor-shame society like they did, we don't recognize that. But what happened was Jesus humiliated. Now that wasn't his intention. His intention was simply to teach what he knew God wanted taught. And the humiliation came because they were not teaching what God wanted to taught. But you know what happens. If somebody is constantly beating you in your debates and controversies, it will feel like they're humiliating you. And that is exactly what Jesus was doing to the Jewish leaders. Jesse?
He wasn't even saying anything. The fact that he didn't say anything to his disciples, he was teaching them by not saying you shouldn't do that.
Okay. Jesus responded to them, haven't you read what David and his companions did when he became hungry? How he entered the house of God and took the sacred bread. Now, this bread is technically called the bread of the presence. But presence, whose presence? God's presence. So that's the reason I used the term sacred to get it over. It was set apart to God, dedicated to God, and was supposed to be eaten only by the priests. Okay. What Jesus is doing is a good rabbinic reply to the Pharisees. And he's saying, look, go to the text. I never will forget what one of the best teachers I've ever had of the New Testament, Abe Malherbe. If you know any French, you know Malherbe is the English equivalent of weed. Mal, bad, herb, plant. And I used to kid him. His name was Weed.
Bad weed.
What?
A bad weed.
A bad weed, yeah, bad weed. And bad plant. I think about the advertisements for all these law firms that when they say call 800 bad drug, get your money. Anyway, he said, don't ever discuss anything except the meaning of texts. If you went to him and said, Abe, what do you think about X? He'd say, what text are we talking about? And that's the way it ought to be. It doesn't make a cotton picking bit of difference what I think. Do you realize that?
Yeah.
Yeah. That had a connotation.
Yes, for that one.
Set yourself up.
Try
Yeah.
to leave her home.
But I tell you what, I like to have somebody like Lydia in the class because I need to be made aware of that because it's so easy to say, I say. And the only human being who ever had the right to say, but I say, is Jesus. No other human being has a right to say that. And I don't care if it's N.T. Wright or some ignorant backwoods preacher that is barely literate. They neither one have the right to say, I say. And I'm somewhere between those two. I won't go any further. Okay. He entered the house of God and took the sacred bread, which is not lawful for anyone to eat except priests. He gave some to his companions to eat. Now, in parallels to this passage, he goes into a much longer argument. The Gospels that were intended for Jewish consumption, he goes into much more detail. This Gospel of Luke, which was intended for Gentile reading, says, then he said to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. He shortcuts, Luke does, the other arguments. And if you want to know them, you have to go to another gospel. The bottom line is, Jesus is saying, I am God, and I was one who rested on the seventh day. And I helped institute the Sabbath day. And if I change the rules, it's altogether fitting I should. I am Lord of the Sabbath. And that, Luke considered that sufficient for the Gentile audience. They didn't need to get bogged down in the rabbinic type discussion. And that's as far as we're going to go because we're studying the Gospel of Luke now. People are always asking, well, what did he really say? We have that. I can only tell you what the different texts say. I was not there. I may be old, but I was not there. And so I have to take the text. There's a lot of people get tired of me insisting that the text has to rule. But it's the only way I know for the Word of God to control what I think, is let the text tell me what it says. And this is sufficient. He is Lord of the Sabbath. Now, you can imagine how that went over with the Pharisees. It didn't. But he was so definite with it, and he proved that he was Lord of the Pharisees by always coming out on top with them. And he always got the last word. We'll get some more of this in that last week of his life on the great, what's called the Great Day of Questions, when all the people, the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Herodians, all came and asked him questions. We'll get back to that, and Luke covers that day pretty well. Mike.
I think it might be helpful for others that are looking at this issue to know why all the Gospels have the Sabbath controversies. They all have the temple controversies, because these were issues that were raised during the trial of Jesus. And one of the things that the Gospel writers make a deal about is that even the accusers couldn't get their story straight about the charges.
Yes, and this is what makes his crucifixion unjust.
Right.
And that he was in the right, but died nevertheless. And that Luke is one of the ones who really emphasizes the fact that Pilate wanted to pardon or not crucify him, but that when they threatened him, he said, "You're not a friend of Caesar if you let this man go free." And that was hitting Pilate right where he lived, and he wasn't going to go there. Okay. On another Sabbath, he entered into a synagogue. By the way, when I went through this, I take the capitals out of synagogue. I've got good warrant for that. In fact, I take capitals out of temple courts. I take capitals out of law of Moses. Although my Word 7 professional always calls my hand on law. It puts a green line under it and says, capitalize it. And I say, no, and go on. I argue with my...
Your spell checker.
What?
You argue with your spell checker.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. The Pharisees and those authorized to interpret the law were watching him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath, so that they could bring an accusation against him. Now notice, they were not honest in this. They were watching to see if they could find a way to catch him. And if you're looking for a way to catch somebody, you will probably find it. They did, even though, as Mike pointed out, ultimately they couldn't make their charges stick legally. So they just insisted on them politically. And that's what happened to him. But he knew what they were thinking, and said to the man with the withered hand, "Get up and stand in their midst." Now, in the previous thing about plucking grain on the Sabbath, the aggressor, or the one who was pushing the point, were the Pharisees. Jesus here is the one who is the assertive one. He knows what they're thinking, and so he calls the man up. Now, why would he have the authority to do that? Because as a teacher, he was invited to teach in the synagogue. This is one of the things that each synagogue could do. what the person that I call the president of the synagogue, that's as close an idea as we have, and I know that this is legitimate in some cases, because when they built a mosque just across the street from the Church of Christ building in Falls Church, Virginia, the man who headed that was called the president of the mosque. He and I got quite friendly, and I gave him a New Testament in Arabic, and he gave me a beautifully illustrated Quran, which I still have. He didn't even know that there was such a thing as a New Testament in Arabic, and he put it in their library. And we cooperated. We were trying to get a traffic signal put there, because on Friday night when they had their prayer time, the traffic got real heavy on that State Highway 236, and on Sunday morning it got even heavier when the Falls Church let out. But the state, we just didn't quite have enough traffic on there for the state to put a traffic light in. So we hired a policeman like we do here at Oak Hills, only we have 10 or 12 of them to direct traffic, and it worked pretty well. Okay. Then he said, "Let me ask you a question. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do evil or to do good, to save a life or to destroy it?" Now, notice what Jesus is doing. He's getting right down to the facts of the case. He didn't buy into their casuistic arguments and hair splitting and thing. He says the truth of the matter is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath? If it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath, then it's lawful to heal on the Sabbath. Or is it lawful to do evil on the Sabbath? And what would Jesus have, how would he have answered that question? Now, I have to keep you and Jesse in line. Anybody? You're not going to make a comment, Linda?
No, I was wondering if you would repeat the question again.
Okay. I had hard enough time getting it out the first time. My question is, how would he have answered the question, is it lawful to do evil on the Sabbath?
When you say he, are you referring
Jesus.
to Jesus himself, right? Well, he showed us by his action.
Yeah.
The action that he took following his question.
Yeah, he would have said, no, it is not lawful. Notice what he's doing. He's putting the argument into a question of good or evil, not into a legalistic, casuistic type argument. He's saying what's at stake here is, shall we do good all the time, or shall we do evil? Now, he is implying, however, that if you let somebody stay ill when you could heal them, what? That's evil. That's...
Is there another implication here too? It's because these people that were following Jesus, these Pharisees, that were watching him to try to accuse him of doing something wrong, actually they had evil in their heart.
That's what I was going to bring.
I know. I was leading, hoping somebody would say that. Yes, that's exactly what he's saying. If you say that it's not lawful to heal on the Sabbath, what you're saying is, your wicked intentions triumphed doing good. And see, remember, James has something to say about this. He says, to the one that knows to do good and doesn't do it, to him it's sin. See, we think a lot about that if you act, it's a sin. But there can be sins of omission as well as commission. I've heard preachers make that distinction. And the idea is it's always right to do good because God is good. And God would have no compunction against healing somebody on the Sabbath.
And to kind of put a Old Testament flavor on this, think in terms of Daniel and the people that opposed him were looking for some way to accuse him.
Mm-hmm.
Couldn't find anything, so they had the king make this law so that they could accuse him before the king.
Yes, and notice.
And these Jews should have known that that shows evil intent on their part.
Yes, and so the evil here is what the Pharisees were doing.
Right.
That's the whole point.
It's also interesting to me that the scripture doesn't say that Jesus actually touched him or did anything. He didn't lift a hand. He had the other man lift his hand, and then he was healed. Everyone knew Jesus had done it, but that would be hard to prove in a
court.
legalistic way.
Yes. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but Jesse?
It is good to notice that that's the first thing Luke says about this whole situation. He knew what they were thinking.
Mm-hmm.
He knew their heart.
Yes.
He brings that out.
How many times do you think in Luke's gospel or any of the gospels do we have that idea? He knew what they were thinking. He knew what. Remember, even when the apostles were arguing about who was going to be greatest, when they got where they were going, he said, "What were you talking about when we were on our way?" But he knew what they were talking about. This is an affirmation of the fact he was God in the flesh. And so remember, God knows everything. Jesus in another place, and I know this because I just finished checking the translation. It's over in the, 14th, 15th chapter of Luke, somewhere over there. He said, there is nothing that is whispered in the dark that won't be made public. There's nothing said in private that won't be announced from the rooftops.
So, can you help me understand that it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath? So in the Old Testament, they found a man gathering sticks, and you could make the argument that gathering sticks on the Sabbath is also good. So
Well,
can you parse that out?
Now, here is the thing. For whom was he gathering sticks? He was gathering it for himself. Jesus would make the distinction. The good that you ought to be doing is for others. Does that make?
Yes.
Okay. That's the idea. The argument that the Pharisees made that you've got 6 days to gather sticks, and so if you need sticks, actually it was firewood that he was gathering, and Jesus wouldn't have gathered firewood on the Sabbath because it would be just for his own selfish interest. Remember, that was one of the essences of the temptations that we talked about, is that he refused to use his power in order to feed himself. If he had used that great power he had in a selfish or self-centered way, it would have been evil.
Also, the idea of the manna, remember, was provided twice as much on the day of preparation for the Sabbath, so they wouldn't have to gather it on the Sabbath.
And it turned rotten.
If they gathered too much.
See, that was for teaching purposes. And that God intended for the Jews to learn from that you didn't serve yourself on the Sabbath. That was the essence of doing evil on the Sabbath, to satisfy your own desire. Even carried over in James when he says, you ask and you don't receive because you want to spend it on your own desires.
Clarification on the manna, if they gathered more than their need on any other day but Friday, it would go bad. But if they gathered it on Friday, it would be preserved over Sabbath. So it was kind of like a way of teaching them both
Positive and negative.
positive and negative.
Yes, I had that in mind.
Yeah.
You can't cover every detail.
That's true.
I wish I could. Okay. After looking around at them, he said to the man, "Extend your hand." He did so, and his hand was restored in its natural condition. Now I like this next line. They were filled with fury and started discussing among themselves what they might do to Jesus. Now, there is an increasing virulence about. A little later, they're going to say what they might do to arrest him, and then still later, what they might do to kill him. And Luke throws in these little increasing explanation. Here it's increasing virulence against Jesus. Okay, now, when did Jesus select the 12?
At the beginning of his ministry.
What?
At the beginning of his ministry.
Well, in some of the Gospels, especially Mark and some in Matthew, you might assume that it was at the beginning. Actually, if you take all three of the synoptics, you're going to have to say what? I don't know. You see, since Matthew is listed first in most of our Bibles, all of our Bibles, we tend to take Matthew as the paradigm. And you would think from Matthew that it was much earlier. And you cannot, what I'm trying to get to you to realize is that there is not a strict chronological order in any of the Gospels. If we make a chronology of the life of Jesus, we're doing it on our own. It's just not in the text. It's only by counting the number of Passovers that he attended with his disciples that we can know that his ministry was about 3+ years.
Mainly because of John mentioning a second one.
Yes, that's right. So I want you to realize that the Gospels were not written to satisfy our curiosity. They were written to show who it was that went to the cross. That's mainly what they're for. They're also to give us the heart of the teaching of Jesus about how to behave. And in the ancient world, that was the important thing. And it should be the important thing today. But we have that modern precisionist attitude. We want to know what came first and what came second and what came third, and so we tend to impose that. No, it's just 10:30.
That's what I mean. That's how we do things, though.
Oh, I thought you were talking about my time was running out. Yes.
Jesse's hungry.
What?
Jesse's hungry.
That's one thing I like about this class. We can laugh at each other. And that's, that's healthy. It really is healthy. Okay. Okay. During that time, now notice how indefinite that is. Since he hadn't told us when the plucking of grain was and when the withered hand in Mark comes in the 2nd chapter of Mark, and that's the reason we think that it's early. But remember, he had been teaching perhaps as long as a year, even possibly longer than that, before he selected the 12. Now, there's been all kinds of controversy about what an apostle is. I take the passage in Acts 1 where they select somebody to take the place of Judas and there it is somebody who has been with us since the baptism of John and witnessed the resurrection of Jesus. And that's what an apostle was. That's the reason Paul could be an apostle. He knew about the life of Jesus because he was in the area and he witnessed the resurrected Christ on the road to Damascus. And I say that to eliminate the idea that we have apostles in that sense today. Since the word apostle is identical in root meaning to the idea of missionary, then we have apostles / missionaries today, but they are not witnesses of the resurrection of Christ. And that's the primary function that they served in the early church.
Could we almost say it was a man-made idea?
What?
The idea of who should be an apostle? Because I think you can stretch what they said in the first part of Acts to let it fit Paul, but even Paul admitted, I'm like a child, born out of at the wrong time.
Yes, and what I'm getting at is the idea that of apostolic succession, and that came about when people were trying to decide what is Orthodox Christianity and what isn't. And they made a rule that said if you can trace it back to an apostle, it's true. If you can't, it isn't.
Charles, Jesus probably did not call these men apostles then, right? This is written after the fact because they wouldn't have been witnesses to the resurrection at the time he called them out, right?
No, but that's the reason they were saying. Notice it does say in this text, whom he named apostles. Now, that may be prospective, proprioceptive, or whatever you want to call it. That is anticipation, what they were going to be. During that time, he went into the mountain to pray. He spent the whole night praying to God. Have you ever prayed all night? I have tried. I have never succeeded. Sometimes I've had problems going to sleep, and I start praying, and guess what? It's a great soporific. But my mind works so fast that I can think about a whole book of the Bible and overnight. So I'm not apologizing. I'm not saying I'm right. I'm just saying the idea of being close enough to God to pray all night, I have to admit, is foreign to me. I'm making a confession, if anything. And I've known a few people who prayed overnight. Right now I can think about 3 or 4 that I know that do that regularly. I'm not going to mention them. 2 or 3 of them are here in this church. And I think it would be not right for me to tell you who that was. But I'm confessing that it's hard for me to even conceive of that. And it makes me in awe of the intimacy between Jesus, the human being, and his Father in heaven. He could spend all night in communication and communion with his Father. And I think you can see a pattern of when there was something that that was important to do. And I remember the prayers in the Garden of Gethsemane that lasted most of the night. I remember praying on and talking to Elijah and Moses on the Mount of Transfiguration. Our people that just got back from visiting Israel are not here. They'll show you the mountain of Transfiguration. Do you know this road that takes up and goes up to the New Star Energy Building across on top of the hill across the way? The road up that mountain looks just like that one. It overlooks the plain of Sharon, where the so-called Rose of Sharon grows. And when we were there and went up that road, the Rose of Sharon, which it's actually a kind of poppy-looking flower, was just red all over that beautiful, well-watered plain. And as you wind up that mountainside, you can see it. We were in a bus, and it was quite a very moving experience for me.
It seems like when Jesus had these times of prayer, it was kind of in like a sandwich of having confrontations or healing people, and then in preparation for the next things that would come. It seems like he kind of sandwiched those events in prayer.
Well, I think you can go even further than that, Jesse. We have discovered, and will discover more in the book of Luke, that when he healed, it took energy. And it's almost like he needs to recharge his energy. Now, I know about praying for strength and clarity of mind and things like that. And that is one of the great privileges we have as believers, to pray for things like that. So I can understand that. It is just having enough to talk about to last all night that I find difficult to imagine, because I don't. And that's probably because I'm very limited in my spirituality. He spent the whole night praying to God. When daylight came, he summoned his disciples, and from among them he selected 12, whom he named apostles. And of course, apostle comes from apo, from or out, and the stole, which means is a root for send. And so an apostle is one sent. And this is from Greek root. Missionary is from a Latin root, missio, which means I send out. And so missionary and apostle are synonyms of each other. But the apostles, the 12, were selected by him, and he did not only to be witnesses of his resurrection, but to receive the inner meaning teaching. How often from now on are we going to find that he taught, say, in parables, and then in private he explained the parables to whom? The 12. We'll find him teaching about something, and then in private. Remember, even in the last week of his life, they're going out of the temple after he's taught in the temple courts, and they're going to cross to Bethany, and the apostles say, "Look at these great, huge stones." If you've ever been there, you will know, because there's one place, and that's on the so-called west wall. The stones are, some of them are as thick as this wall here, and probably as far as from that corner to this window on that side right there, about where you are. It's a big stone, and they are, you can tell they were put there by Herod because they have a dish-shaped scoop out of the wall. And my time is now up, so you didn't. Okay.